I'm Rich Andreski, Bureau Chief for Public Transportation at the Connecticut Department of Transportation. And I'd like to welcome you to Along the Lines, a podcast series where we'll explore current issues and ideas on Connecticut's public transportation system. Hello, I'm Rich Andreski, and welcome to another episode of Along the Lines. Did you know that Connecticut's rail system provided more than 40 million trips annually prior to the pandemic? Yes, you heard that right, 40 million. And that includes all travel on CT Rail Hartford Line, CT Rail Shoreline East, and the Metro North operated New Haven Line. That's the busiest commuter rail line in the nation. That's pretty impressive for a state like Connecticut. Today, we're going to take a look at the state's rail system with our guest, Jim Cameron. Jim spent nearly 20 years on the Connecticut Commuter Rail Council. This is the voice for riders on the various rail systems, including for his chairman, where he advocated for passengers. That council played an integral role in updating and modernizing rail cars, equipment, and stations. Jim then went on to start the Commuter Action Group and is a columnist for Hearst, Connecticut newspapers, where he writes a biweekly column on various aspects of transportation and policy. Jim, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Rich. Good to be here.
Jim, your history as an advocate goes back many decades, and I know that you were one of the founding members of the Commuter Rail Council in Connecticut. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about the evolution of that group? How did it get started, and what was your role?
Well, the what was officially then known as the Connecticut Metro North Commuter Rail Council was created after Metro North came into being in the 1970s. And the idea of the legislature in creating the body was to give voice to commuters. Because Metro North was being hired by the state to run, in many cases, our trains in our state, and DOT and Connecticut did not have a seat on the Metro North or the MTA, their parent board of directors, it was felt that commuters needed to have some sort of input, some voice. So the creation of the Commuter Council was to make sure that commuters were heard. And the council would meet on a regular basis. I think by mandate it only had to meet quarterly, but when I was on the council, it met every month. It would meet with Metro North, the operating agency, and with the Connecticut DOT, and in some cases with Amtrak when we were talking about Shoreline East issues. And we would talk about all kinds of things. You know, we could talk about schedule changes, fare increases, but mostly we were trying to look from the rider's perspective about what needed improvement on the trains.
You know, Jim, I'm not sure our listeners all know the history there of the Metro North MTA New York relationship with Connecticut. It's worth noting that that Connecticut, although many folks refer to that system in Connecticut as the Metro North system, it is in fact owned by the state of Connecticut, and the Connecticut Department of Transportation is charged with managing that service, providing the funding, as well as investing in improvements in the infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's right, Rich. I think it's very confusing to the average passenger who goes down to their train station and doesn't realize that the train station and the parking, a parking lot are probably owned by the DOT, but administered by their local town. The train that they're getting on is perhaps the rail car is owned by Connecticut, but operated by Metro North. And one of the things I suggested early on, which I still would think would be a great idea, would be to put a sign up in every station saying, "Welcome to the XYZ station. Parking at this station is administered by the town of such and such. Here's a phone number. If you have questions about the maintenance of the station, here's who's in charge of that. Questions about the schedule on the trains, that's Metro North. Here's their number. Complaints, if you have them about operation of the trains, should go to this person," because there are so many moving parts, so many overlapping jurisdictions that I don't think people understand that relationship.
You know, Jim, I'm going to take that back to the team. That's a fantastic suggestion. I'm just wondering if you could speak then to the history at the time. Going back in the original founding days of the commission, what was the state of affairs at that point? What was the condition of the infrastructure like?
It was bad and getting worse, and not for lack of trying by the DOT and by Metro North. And sometimes people think that the Commuter Council and the DOT and Metro North have an adversarial relationship, and I don't think that's the case. I think we're there to be a voice of. We were there. I'm not on that council anymore. We were there to be a voice of commuters and to give feedback to the railroad. And in many cases, they were enthusiastic in their reception of ideas, like the one I just gave to you there as well too. But the railroad was dealing with old equipment that was in many cases older than the passengers who were riding on the trains themselves. As I said, the old M2, M4, M6 cars, um, were 30 years into a 25-year life expectancy. So one of the things that we could do on the council was to advocate that the state invest in new rail cars, which they did, thanks to the recommendation of the um, Transportation Advisory Board. We dealt with other more kind of mundane issues on an almost day to day basis. I think one of the big themes that I remember from all those years I served on the council was lack of communications. Something would go wrong, a train would be late, and there'd be no way for the passenger on that train to find out why. This is all pre email, Twitter, social media, etc. It was very spotty. Some conductors would do a good job of relaying information on the train using the PA system. Here's why we're late. Here's what's going to happen. There weren't even PA state announcements made at the train stations themselves in some cases. So we were constantly persuading, beating on Metro North, saying, you got to do a better job of communicating with your passengers. I don't think people objected when things went wrong. Stuff happens. Old equipment breaks down, the wires go down, but don't leave me like a mushroom sitting in the dark being fed a bunch of what. Tell me what's going on so I can make decisions. This is even pre cell phone in some cases. Should I get off at the next station and call a car or use a payphone, call somebody and let them know what's going on? So those are the kind of issues that we dealt with on a regular basis.
Jim, there's so much to unpack there. I'd like to talk about the changing customer expectations, but before we go there, talk a little bit about the elected officials and their support for rail. I've observed in my short 20-something year career a sea change in how people view rail. So, can you talk
Yeah.
about the changing attitudes? How did that evolve in terms of the desire to invest in rail in Connecticut?
Well, we have to remember that the availability of service on Metro North was crucial to the economic vitality of this state. People like myself, moved to Fairfield County from New York City to raise a family, and we chose to live where we did as opposed to Westchester or Long Island or New Jersey because of the reliability of the train service. And I think it's still true that 40% of all the taxes in this state are paid out of Fairfield County itself. People live in Fairfield County because it's got a good quality of life, good schools, it's close to the beaches and the golf courses, etc. But they mostly, this is all pre-COVID, of course, got on a train every day and went to a high-paying job in New York City. And they brought that money home. They invested in their local real estate. They paid taxes both in New York and in Connecticut. So I think it was important to keep reminding lawmakers of how important that train service was. And if that train was not running, people wouldn't be living here. The price of real estate in these communities served by Metro North would go down. And I think that the legislature finally caught on. I remember I forget when it was, but there was one year in which the Transportation Committee of the legislature, which has jurisdiction over transportation, was suddenly populated with a huge number of people from Fairfield County. much to the surprise of the chairman, who at that point I think had come from Wethersfield or someplace upstate. So I think the legislature got the message, and I think they understand how important mass transit has been to the economic vitality of Connecticut, and I think will continue to be.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, Jim. In our hyper partisan world that we live in today, it's remarkable how we have such a broad and deep support for investment in rail, and that's heartening. And I think it does tie back to the view that investment in rail is good for property values. It's certainly good for economic development. Um, and so I think the role the commuter council had played over the last couple of decades has been pretty critical to that in terms of transforming opinions and representing the interests of the riders. You mentioned changing expectations of the riders. Years ago, there was really no alternative, right, to communicate. You had to rely on that rail conductor, and I think today everyone in their pocket has access to the world, and so customers are definitely changing attitudes and opinions about what is acceptable. Where do you see the greatest opportunity right now in terms of improving that customer experience? Um,
Well, I think Metro North deserves a lot of credit for finally, getting religion and believing in investing in the technology. I remember the first thing they did was they installed an opt-in email system where you could get email updates from Metro North. Then they started doing social media, both of which the Commuter Council was doing before they did, by the way. And I think it was partly the Commuter Council's adoption of that technology and pushing out information to commuters who had opted into our list that forced their hand. Now there's a full time person at Metro North who's sitting in the control room right next to the people that are dispatching the trains. And if the old rule was five trains had to be affected, five trains had to be affected before they would do a tweet or an email. Now, one train that's more than 10 or 15 minutes late, they send out a tweet. And I think more information is better than less. So I give credit to Metro North for finally adopting that technology. I think your question about what can they do next. Some interesting things are happening around how they're handling COVID. Not only are they disinfecting the cars themselves, but Metro North held a hackathon, and some students, I believe, at Stanford University came up with a new add-on to the Train Time app, which is going to allow passengers waiting at a train station to be informed 5 minutes before their train arrives to pick them up, which cars have the fewest passengers on board. Now, this would be unheard of a few years ago. The way this works, by the way, is that every train, subway, commuter train, when the doors close and they leave the station, the train kind of weighs itself. It asks itself, how much heavier did this car get when passengers got on at that train station? So I can make my next brake application and make sure the train stops on time. So they just kind of reversed engineered that and said, okay, which car is the lightest? That'll be the one that passengers should sort of line up next to. So you're not getting on in the front car and having to walk through three or four cars to find a good seat. Um, this technology is not yet available in Connecticut on the M8 cars, but I think it's a good example of what the railroad's been doing to try and cope with this new normal around the pandemic.
Jim, you're well informed, my friend. That's a great perspective, and I'm sure our listeners will be curious to learn more about that. What are the other types of communication? Obviously, rises to the top, but the way in which people work is changing right before our eyes. COVID has shifted people to a telework schedule. Many are not commuting. What do you think we should be looking at in terms of bringing back the riders? What are some of the amenities or services that we should be offering to encourage folks to use rail?
I hope that Metro North and the DOT are thinking about how to adapt to this new normal. It's not a matter of attracting passengers back to the train. I don't think we can do that by, having a bar car. Cigar car would be okay for me. It's not the amenities. It's not adding Wi-Fi on the train. I don't think that's the answer to all this. It's, do I really need to get on that train? Does my boss need me to be back in the city? And if the answer to both of those is no, I don't know what the railroad can do to try and lure those passengers back. And that raises a whole bunch of other issues, like how are we going to keep operating these trains even before COVID hit? They were operating at a deficit and expensive. Trains are expensive to operate. How are we going to keep operating these trains? What are the alternatives? Fare increases, service cuts, layoffs? None of them are very attractive.
Jim, this is probably the fundamental question going forward for the next at least the next 5 years. What do we do with the extensive network of services and infrastructure that we built up to serve peak demand? Our listeners may not know this, but it's intuitive if you think about it, that public transportation, just like our highways, is designed for peak travel, meaning we acquire a rail fleet, our rail yards, our stations, everything is built up for that peak hour. And if the peak hour is no longer the peak hour, what does that mean? And I would offer that it gives us an opportunity to think differently about service. For example, Governor Lamont has been very enthusiastic about what we can do to speed up travel time between our major cities and New York. And historically, that was going to be very challenging. We just simply had too many trains on the railroad. There wasn't a lot of opportunity to add express services. So that is something that we're looking at. It's certainly we're going to need riders to fill those trains, but also I think historically we've measured success based on the number of people traveling in and out of New York, and I think we need to broaden the measure of success. And that is, there's lots of reasons that we offer rail service. It is an anchor for redevelopment. You just need to go to Stanford right now and witness these large towers Charter Communications is building right next to the rail station. We've seen robust investment up and down the Hartford line since we introduced that service. So I think we really need to redefine what it is we're trying to accomplish here. I don't know if you would agree with that perspective, but that's where my mind is at the moment.
And I'm gratified to hear you say that, because that's exactly the kind of forward thinking that I think is necessary. I think that Metro North needs to be realistic and not assume once we've all got our shots that we're all going to be back to normal. And you're right. The railroad has kept the fares at off-peak levels to try and encourage ridership. Interestingly, weekend ridership recently has been higher than weekday ridership. I don't know where these people are going in New York City with the theaters closed and the museums closed, but that's kind of encouraging. And I think the railroad deserves a lot of credit for trying to maintain service, running full length trains, giving people lots of room to spread out and feel safe. I would feel safe taking the train if I had to go into New York City now. I don't think it's a question of feeling unsafe on mass transit. I think it's really a question of, do I need to take that particular train? I'm also a little concerned. You mentioned, the success of places like Stanford and transit-oriented development. Building up offices and apartments near the train stations, so people don't need to have a car. They can, walk from their apartment or their office to the train station. I'm wondering what's going to happen to that and that investment if the transit is not as essential as it used to be. Spreading out the demand, I think is a good idea, and I think people kind of will be able to do that now themselves. Maybe they don't have to be on a train at 5:30 in the morning that 1 or 2 days they're going into the city. Maybe it'll spread out the demand, but it's essential that we keep and maintain some kind of level of service, both in peak hours and off peak hours. Because if we don't, then we start a downward spiral. If trains only run every 2 hours instead of every hour, people are going to go, well, maybe I'll just drive.
Yeah, we have a remarkable asset here that we just simply can't walk away from. The potential here. I'm of the mind that there is going to be a mini economic boom following this pandemic. I think people are hungry to get out. That they're looking for social interaction. We may not see the riders return in the morning commute to the degree we had previously, but I do believe we're going to see significant ridership taking in a Yankees game or Broadway show, going down to New York for a whole variety of reasons. I think that we may see that in the third or fourth quarter of 2021. I am a little concerned, as you expressed. I share your concern about the financial sustainability of our system. Although we've made a lot of progress, there's quite a bit more to do. We have, for example, a 110-year-old walk bridge that is in need of replacement. We've got other movable bridges that are well past their useful life. We have a rail fleet that operates on Shoreline East and Hartford Line that needs to be replaced. Um, what are your thoughts about the sustainability of that system, and how do we move forward um, with a sustainable financial plan that makes sense for riders and taxpayers?
Well, we're singing from the same hymnal in harmony right now, Rich. Uh, the issue with Metro North and with the DOT has never been one of, lack of vision. It's always been a lack of money. Where do we find the money? Uh, and it's interesting that Metro North says that pre-COVID, almost half of their revenue came from the sale of monthly passes, regular 5 day a week commuters. If they're gone, that deficit is just going to balloon. Yet we still try to, keep the railroad in a state of good repair, replacing bridges like the Walk Bridge in South Norwalk, which dates from the Victorian era, is something we should have done decades ago. And I think now they're realizing, okay, we're going to finally have to do something. And, we could do a whole other program on what's going to happen to the Special Transportation Fund, which is what subsidizes mass transit, which pays DOT for the work that it does, plowing roads, repairing bridges, etc. That fund is running out of money. It goes into the red this year. And when that happens, that means we're not going to be able to float any more bonds. 40% of your budget, Rich, tell me if I'm wrong here, 40% of the DOT's budget pays debt service on bonds that were issued as much as 30 years ago. We are still paying off the sins of our parents and our grandparents. It's time for us to get serious about this and talk about other revenue streams to keep transportation going in the state. Gasoline tax, tolls, vehicle miles tax, sales tax increase. None of them are very attractive, but one of them is going to be, or more of them are going to be necessary.
I can't help but think about other uh, parts of the country where they've committed to investment. Denver comes to mind. Denver, a couple of decades ago, introduced the T-Rex program, which introduced a network of light rail lines and transit routes, and that has paid dividends. Significant investment there. Denver at one point was not much larger than the Hartford metro area, and now has grown into an economic powerhouse in that part of the country. And
Remember also that, we're lucky here in Connecticut because we inherited uh, a right of way where the tracks run along the coast that was built 100 years ago. That's the good news. I mean, to have tracks, to add new tracks now would be, impossibly expensive. So we inherited a system that was the vision of somebody brilliant 100 years ago. That's the good news. The bad news is it's 100 years old, and we're trying to DOT is trying to maintain it and keep that system going. So, the Hartford line is a good example, I think. Shoreline East, decades before it, when the DOT decided it wanted to expand commuter rail service east of New Haven, running it all the way to New London. And I remember this from 20 years ago on the Commuter Council, was discussion about why don't we run a commuter rail line from New Haven to Hartford and north to Springfield? Well, both of those are a reality now. And I think the Hartford line is an example of DOT's vision coming to life, federal money being invested in that, the stations that have been built up around it. And as I understand it, the ridership on the Hartford line has come back, albeit from a smaller base, has come back stronger than on the main line, which tells me people want that kind of mass transit alternative. Even the bus rapid transit system, CT Fast Track between New Britain and Hartford, another success story that I don't think people in Connecticut realize is it's attracting transportation people from around the country to come and see what can be done right in terms of bus rapid transit as well.
We have been. I'm glad you brought up Hartford Line. We've been very creative at the DOT about going after discretionary federal funding. We were successful at in the last year alone, bringing in over 17 million for the new rail station at Windsor Locks. We were also the recipients of a grant to expand service and add an additional round trip to the schedule in the morning for anyone traveling to Hartford. And so I think we have to be creative and nimble. There's clearly going to be some sort of federal program, a transportation program, if not a stimulus program. So we're watching that and going to be aggressive about going after those dollars. Um, you've since moved on from the Commuter Rail Council, Jim. If I could change gears for a moment, and but you've stayed very active in terms of advocacy, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your role now as a columnist with the Hearst organization, and just how you advocate for riders in your current role.
Thanks for asking. uh, 2013 is when I left the recreated Commuter Rail Council. It had been given a broader mandate in terms of geography, but I think it had been diminished in its powers and responsibility. And I felt I could do more on the outside than on the inside. And that's how I created the Commuter Action Group. And it really speaks to what you were saying earlier in terms of evolving technology. Uh, you know, People were on the train, they have a cell phone in their hand, they see something wrong. They're not going to wait till they get to their office to pull out a quill pen and a piece of paper to write a letter of complaint. The Commuter Action Group is a website, it's a virtual complaint box, if you will, where you can see something on the train, fire up the website, immediately send a note to Metro North so that they're aware of what's going on. And there's a directory there of who your state representative and who your state senator are. And I always suggest you copy them. Let them know that as a constituent of theirs, you're not happy with how Metro North is doing something. Out of that also evolved the newspapers coming to me and saying, you've written letters to the editor. Would you like to write a column? And I said, sure. And originally it was mostly dealing with Metro North. And then they said, well, why don't you write about the highways? And I said, sure. I've even written about ferry boats and airports, anything. The column is called Getting There. And it's really a column about the crucial role that transportation plays in our lives, the economy, and the future of our state. So, given that I'm writing for Hearst now, from newspapers all the way from Greenwich to New Haven, north to Danbury, I'm trying to take a kind of a larger perspective as well too. And I'm just meeting all the aspirations I ever had as a young man. I wanted your job, Rich. I wanted to work as an engineer and design rail systems of the future. And I went to Lehigh University and lasted one semester in the civil engineering program, went into journalism instead, but now I've kind of come full circle. So I have no formal degrees, but I study this issue. I watch what's going on in Hartford, and I try to give voice to commuters. And I get tweets and emails every day from commuters asking questions that either I try to answer or I send them in the direction of the people who really can.
Well, Jim, you've always been a fantastic advocate. You have a way of not mincing words, and I've seen you at public meetings, and we appreciate that. Matter of fact, I'll tell you at the DOT, we will frequently hear, "Did you see the latest Jim Cameron column?" And so you're definitely reaching opinion makers, leaders, policymakers. it's good to have you advocating in Connecticut. You certainly can say things that we can't.
Yeah, before we go, I want to make sure that people know that the Commuter Rail Council still exists, and that the chairman of that group, the guy who took over from me, Jim Gilday, could not be with us today, but he's doing a great job. You can find them online, ctcommuterrailcouncil.org. They meet on a regular basis, I think every month. We used to meet only in Stamford because it was convenient for everybody. Now the Commuter Council moves up and down the line. They've been obviously meeting virtually for months now. They're looking for new members, especially commuters who ride on the Waterbury or the Danbury branch. But there's a lot of good information that's on their website. They collect a lot of data, but they're there to really, be that feedback loop from commuters back to the DOT and Metro North. So I encourage anybody listening to this podcast to check out ctcommuterrailcouncil.org.
I couldn't agree more with you, Jim. Jim Gilday is a good partner. We've enjoyed working with him, and we'll have him on a future podcast, certainly.
Good. He's a good guy.
Yeah, certainly. I want to wrap up at this point and just with a big thank you to you for making the time for us here on the Along the Lines podcast. Always enjoy talking with you. Your insight is always helpful and illuminating. And I hope you have a great day, Jim.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'll see you on the train, Rich.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for listening to this episode of Along the Lines. This is your host, Rich Andreski. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe and share.